Welcome to We the People, a Bradley Speaker Series. I'm Rick Graber, president of the Bradley Foundation. Thanks for joining us for this episode. Well, we're now almost a year into the COVID pandemic, and all of us have had to adapt to new rules and regulations. And many of these changes have been, to say the least, confusing and frustrating. Yet some policies have actually improved opportunity for employment and have increased access to health care. With me to discuss these reforms and more is Robert Alt, President and CEO of the Buckeye Institute. Buckeye is an Ohio-based think tank whose mission is to advance free market public policy in the states. And Buckeye's been a true leader in advocating for free market policies throughout the pandemic and has been a strong advocate for advancing workplace freedom. Robert, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick. Glad to be here.
Robert, let's start by talking about the pandemic's impact on public policy. While states by and large have hurt business, there actually have been some silver linings. And one of those is the temporary removal of barriers to employment, I think particularly in the medical field. Talk a little bit about some of those barriers and why they should be permanently removed.
Well, thank you again so much. It's so important that we start by talking about barriers to employment. It reminds me that during the shutdown order last year, I went into my office in downtown Columbus to take care of some essential business. As I entered our office building, I was approached by a panhandler. After I completed my work, upon exiting our high-rise building, I was approached by another panhandler. The situation was notable because Columbus doesn't have the level of panhandling that one might see in larger cities. What surprised me more was that what the second man said to me as he approached. It has really stuck with me. While asking for money, he simply noted, "I'd work if they'd let me. I'd work if they'd let me." Think about it for a moment. What this gentleman really wanted wasn't a handout. He wanted to work if they'd only let him. As you'll recall, President Reagan famously said that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And while extreme measures may in extraordinary circumstances be necessary to protect public health, the quarantines and shutdowns nonetheless became the problem to millions of workers who unwillingly joined the unemployment lines. These Americans needed paychecks, not government stimulus checks. Accordingly, getting America back to work and preventing the next pandemic requires us to look critically at state and federal regulations that create needless barriers to the delivery of medical services or to unleashing American ingenuity. So let's talk about two of those barriers and what we did in Ohio. When New York City faced an early crisis with COVID numbers, doctors and nurses from all over the country, Ohio included, went there to lend a hand. But New York doctors and nurses couldn't come to provide care in Ohio because of our restrictive licensing laws and practice laws. Buckeye successfully advocated for an executive order that allowed licensed doctors and nurses from one state to practice in Ohio. Or take telehealth. At the start of the pandemic, Ohio had telehealth. Well, kind of. You could see a doctor, you could use telehealth after seeing a doctor in person. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose during ordinary times and even more so during a pandemic. Buckeye was able to successfully advocate for using an emergency executive action to eliminate this nonsensical requirement. As a result, telehealth visits in Ohio went from a few thousand a month to a few 100,000 per month. But in both of these cases, the changes are temporary. They are emergency executive actions. And they're part of about a dozen changes that we were able to get into place during the pandemic to sweep away needless regulations. We're now working to make these changes permanent. The urgency and the exigency of the pandemic may be gone, but the utility of telehealth would still exist after this. The usefulness of having doctors and nurses be able to practice reasonably across state lines is still there. Or to use yet another example, we've promoted the emergency action which permits pharmacists to be able to do COVID testing. Those sorts of protocols that permit pharmacists to be able to perform certain basic testing, are the sorts of things that should survive the pandemic. Common sense should prevail.
Common sense indeed. The past year really has taught us a lot about federalism, as states have really taken dramatically different approaches to navigating this pandemic. Florida and New York could not be more different. Are there any states that you think that have handled the pandemic particularly well, and what can states learn from them?
Well, I think one of the big lessons to be learned in handling the pandemic, and something that we emphasized to our governor when he was looking at a possible second shutdown, is that the way to handle the pandemic isn't through legal sanction, but through moral suasion. And here's what I mean by that. The states don't have enough police to check every business, nor should they. You need to encourage businesses and individuals alike to be responsible. But that doesn't require closing down. That requires, the golden rule: doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, thinking about your fellow man and acting responsibly, taking reasonable precautions, but not engaging in actions that are crippling to the economy or that actually hurt our fellow men. So I think these are the guiding principles, and you saw as well sort of a shift from the early days of the pandemic, where the question was something essential, to later on, could a business be operated in a manner that was safe? This was an inquiry which was a much better way of looking at these particular questions, because previously you had small businesses that may not have been essential in the sense of they weren't necessarily providing groceries, but they were certainly essential to the business owner and to the employees who relied upon that business for their livelihood, perhaps to the customers who were denied the opportunity to do business with that particular shop. So being able to ask the more accurate question of, can it operate in a safe fashion, really allowed the states to open up in a more common sense fashion.
Let's pivot a little bit to workplace freedom, which I know has been an important topic for you in Buckeye. Primary impact of the United States Supreme Court's decision in Janus was that public sector employees are just no longer forced to pay union dues. But despite that victory, unions are still trying to do an end run around the law. Describe a few of the tactics that they're using and what the Buckeye Institute is trying to do to stop them.
Sure. I think one of the common tactics, quite frankly, is just putting as many obstacles in the path of an employee as possible who's seeking to exercise their Janus rights. It's not uncommon, for instance, for the opt-out requirement. If you're already a member of the union and you're seeking to exercise your Janus rights, for the contract to require individuals to know, for instance, when their employment began, because they have to actually opt out within so many days of their anniversary date. So they have to first know when their anniversary date is. Second, calculate and send in their opt-out request precisely within, oftentimes 14 to 30 days of that date. I've seen requirements that they send in such requests in triplicate to multiple different locations. I've heard of unions requiring that the request be made in person during business hours, which ends up being, of course, extraordinarily difficult for those employees who actually have to work during those hours. And then even if you end up sort of hopping on one foot while patting your head and rubbing your stomach and doing everything that's required, frequently we get calls from individuals where they just never heard back from the union after that request. They got a blanket denial that stating that they didn't meet the requirements, but failing to tell the employee what requirements they failed to meet. It's almost as if they didn't think that there was a constitutional right at stake. And so you just see these sorts of obstacles. And I think really what it comes down to is a tactical sense that if they make it difficult enough, maybe the individuals will just keep on paying. Maybe they'll forget. Maybe they won't be able to find an attorney or someone who will be able to help them to get through this labyrinth and actually have their rights respected.
Well, thanks for your great work in this area. Robert, last question. Let's talk a little bit about what Buckeye's priorities are for the next year.
I think, if I had to sort of sum it up, I think what we're looking to do is to promote durable policy. And to illustrate the importance of durable policy, let's think about rent control in New York City. In 1942, the federal government established rent control to address World War II. When the act expired in 1946, New York State passed its own emergency rent control law, which was then extended repeatedly for a number of years thereafter, until in 2019, New York passed another renewal of the rent control law, hearkening back to the serious public emergency which led to the enactment of the existing laws, which is to say, World War II. What began as a temporary measure to address the emergency of World War II continues today, 79 years after the original passage of the Emergency Act. Regrettably, bad ideas have always enjoyed a stickiness in the realm of public policy. For example, after the state of Ohio issued a stay-at-home order, making it a crime to go into your office if you were not working for an essential business, the state also passed an emergency law that, for the purposes of calculating local income taxes, deemed all work by stay-at-home employees during the emergency to have been performed in those very same offices that they were legally prohibited from entering. Now, I know this probably seems weird. Ohio's law on this is kind of unique in the country, that we have local income taxes. And so most people watching this probably live in states where that's not a thing. But maybe in your state, the biggest city, if that, might have a commuter tax. Here in Ohio, the system allows cities to tax you both where you live and where you work. And those could be different tax rates. And what this particular law does is it frequently imposes a steeper tax burden on individuals who are working from home as if they were going into their office. Not only does this charge employees a higher tax rate, it does so based on a fiction. And a big concern is that this system, this disease, will spread. Other states are already following suit. Massachusetts is seeking to tax New Hampshire residents who are working from their homes in New Hampshire during the pandemic. And so we filed a brief asking the U.S. Supreme Court to take up that case. In Ohio, we've filed multiple lawsuits because we fear if a state can tax not based on the actual fiscal connection with a city, but based on fictions, well, Katie, bar the door. Cash-strapped cities and states will expand the use of this maneuver to fill budget shortfalls. And much like the situation with rent control in New York, it will become completely unmoored from the pandemic or the original justification. Once again, fiscal priorities or emergencies will justify extending the taxing power well beyond what should be constitutional or fair bounds. And we're also looking to take a look at some of those reforms that we got through emergency executive orders during the pandemic and make those permanent, so that those policies which remove restrictions on employment also become permanent.
Great stuff, Robert. And thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for your perspectives, and thanks for the great work that you and your team at Buckeye are doing on behalf of the people of Ohio and the people of our country. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us for this episode of We the People.